The park was serene, sunlight filtering through the trees, families enjoying their day, and joggers making their rounds. But Officer Craig Holden, patrolling the area, wasn't in the mood for tranquility. His eyes narrowed on a lone black man seated on a bench, with a leather bag resting at his feet. To Holden, this man looked out of place. In his mind, people like him didn't belong here unless they were up to no good. He gripped his baton tighter, convinced he was about to catch someone in the act. Little did he know, this suspicious man was about to turn his entire world upside down. Before we dive into this powerful story, a quick message. If you believe stories like this can create awareness, hit the subscribe button and let us know, where are you watching from? Craig Holden prided himself on being sharp, someone who could sniff out trouble before it started. Walking toward the man on the bench, he made no effort to hide his suspicion. "Hey, you," he barked, his tone sharp enough to startle the birds from nearby trees. The man looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Me?" he asked, his voice calm and even. "Yeah, you. What are you doing here?" Holden demanded, his hand already resting on his holstered gun. "Enjoying the park, like everyone else," the man replied, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Don't get smart with me," Holden shot back. "Let me see some ID." The man sighed but complied, pulling out his wallet. He handed over a driver's license with the name Marcus Davis. Holden glanced at it but barely processed the information. In his mind, Marcus was already guilty of something, he just needed to figure out what. "What's in the bag?" Holden asked, nodding toward the leather bag on the ground. "Just work stuff," Marcus replied. "Work stuff, huh? Mind if I take a look?" "Actually, I do mind," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. Holden's eyes narrowed. That answer wasn't what he wanted to hear. "You got something to hide?" "No. But unless you've got probable cause, I don't think you can search my belongings," Marcus said, still calm but now standing his ground. Holden's blood boiled. "You think you're smarter than me? You think you know the law better than I do?" Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him to his feet. "Hey! What are you doing?" Marcus protested, now raising his voice for the first time. "You're under arrest," Holden declared, pulling out his handcuffs. "For what?" "For refusing to cooperate," Holden snapped, though even he knew the excuse was paper thin. As Holden cuffed Marcus, passers-by began to stop and stare. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Marcus noticed but didn't react. He kept his face neutral, his composure intact. "Let's go," Holden muttered, leading Marcus to the squad car parked nearby. He opened the back door and shoved him inside. Inside the squad car, the ride to the station was tense. Marcus sat silently in the back seat, his expression unreadable. Holden glanced at him through the rearview mirror, expecting some kind of outburst, but Marcus remained eerily calm. "You're awfully quiet back there," Holden said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nothing to say," Marcus replied. "Yeah, we'll see about that," Holden muttered. As they approached the station, Holden couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Marcus didn't fit the profile of the usual suspects he dealt with. But Holden pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on what he saw as another job well done. The precinct, a storm brewing. At the station, Holden marched Marcus through the front doors, drawing curious looks from his colleagues. Sergeant Rick Patterson, a grizzled veteran with years of experience, was the first to speak up. "Holden, who's this?" Patterson asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Some guy acting suspicious in the park," Holden replied, his grip on Marcus's arm firm. Patterson frowned. "Suspicious how?" Holden hesitated for a split second before answering. "Wouldn't cooperate. Gave me attitude." Patterson's frown deepened. "That's it?" "Look, Sarge, I know trouble when I see it," Holden said defensively. Patterson sighed but said nothing. He gestured for another officer to process Marcus while he pulled Holden aside. "Listen, Craig," Patterson began, lowering his voice. "You can't just haul people in without a solid reason. You're walking a fine line here." Holden waved him off. "I know what I'm doing." But as Patterson watched Marcus being fingerprinted, something clicked. He'd seen that face before, on a briefing document, a news report, somewhere important. The twist begins. "Wait a second," Patterson said, moving toward the officer processing Marcus. "What's his name?" "Marcus Davis," the officer replied. Patterson's eyes widened. "Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no." "What?" Holden asked, noticing Patterson's sudden change in demeanor. "You've made a huge mistake," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "Marcus Davis," Patterson repeated, turning to face Holden. "He's FBI. High level. And you just arrested him." Holden's face drained of color. He stared at Marcus, who was now watching the scene unfold with a knowing smirk. "Good luck explaining this," Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet authority that sent chills down Holden's spine. "FBI?" Holden stammered, his voice barely audible. "That's not possible." He looked. "You didn't even bother to verify his ID, did you?" Patterson cut in, his tone sharp and furious. "You just saw a black man sitting on a park bench and decided that was enough to haul him in." Holden opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of panic. "Let me talk to the captain," Patterson said, waving another officer over. "And for God's sake, don't let him leave." Marcus speaks up. The agent had been calm throughout the ordeal, but now he decided to break his silence. As Patterson left to find the precinct's captain, Marcus leaned forward slightly, addressing Holden directly. "So," Marcus began, his tone conversational but laced with authority, "you're the kind of officer who judges by appearances, huh? See someone who doesn't look like you, and they're automatically a criminal?" Holden shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "Tell me, Officer Holden, where in your training does it say to ignore due process, fabricate reasons for arrest, and violate someone's rights based on your gut feeling?" The surrounding officers listened in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to intervene. Holden clenched his fists but said nothing, his mind racing. The captain arrives. Captain Ethan Russell entered the room with a storm of authority, his eyes scanning the situation before landing on Marcus. He extended a hand. "Agent Davis," Russell said, his tone apologetic. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus stood, shaking the captain's hand firmly. "Misunderstanding, Captain? I was unlawfully detained and humiliated in front of your officers and the public. That's more than just a misunderstanding." Russell nodded, his expression grim. "You're absolutely right. Please know that this will be dealt with swiftly and appropriately. Officer Holden's actions do not reflect the values of this department." Marcus tilted his head slightly, scrutinizing the captain's words. "I'll reserve judgment on that for now. But I can tell you this isn't just about Holden. It's about a culture that allows people like him to thrive unchecked. I'm not leaving until we address that." Russell hesitated, realizing the gravity of the situation. "We'll discuss this further in my office. Patterson, bring Agent Davis. Holden, you stay here. I'll deal with you later." In the captain's office. The captain's office was stark and functional, the walls lined with commendations and old photographs. Marcus took a seat opposite Russell, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "Let me cut to the chase, Captain," Marcus began. "This department has a problem. And it's not just Holden." Russell leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Agent Davis, I understand your frustration, but—" "This isn't frustration," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "This is a systemic issue. Holden didn't act in a vacuum. He acted this way because he felt emboldened by a culture that excuses or even encourages this behavior." Russell sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if you want to salvage the reputation of your department, you start cleaning house. Training, oversight, accountability, everything needs an overhaul. and I'm going to make sure that happens. Russell's jaw tightened. Are you here as an agent or as a man looking for personal justice? Both, Marcus replied without hesitation. Holden's growing fear. Back in the precinct's main area, Holden paced nervously. Whispers among the other officers grew louder, their words laced with judgment and thinly veiled amusement at his predicament. Man, you really stepped in at this time, one officer muttered under his breath. Shut up, Holden snapped, though his voice lacked its usual edge. He was acutely aware that his actions might not just cost him his job, they could ruin his entire life. For the first time, Holden felt the weight of consequences pressing down on him. The precinct was in turmoil. Whispers of Marcus Davis's wrongful arrest spread through the building like wildfire. Every officer who passed by Holden's desk cast an uneasy glance in his direction. Once respected, now he was a pariah in his own department. He wasn't just facing the wrath of his superiors, but the judgment of his peers. Holden was still reeling from the confrontation with Marcus. He sat in his squad car, staring at his badge, as if hoping it would give him some clarity. What had gone wrong? He had seen Marcus in the park, sitting alone on the bench, and something about him didn't sit right. He had made a snap judgment, one based on preconceived notions, and it had led him to make a reckless mistake. His mind kept racing, the memory of Marcus's unwavering gaze haunting him. Damn it, Holden muttered under his breath, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. He knew he was in deep trouble, but part of him was still trying to justify what he'd done. He'd only followed the instinct that had been drilled into him. If it looks wrong, it probably is. But was that really enough? In the captain's office, Marcus sat across from Captain Russell, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Russell had taken a long time to process everything, but Marcus wasn't interested in waiting around for the captain to sort out his thoughts. The question on the table was simple: what would happen to Officer Holden? Russell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. He was clearly frustrated, though he kept his emotions in check. This is a complicated situation, Agent Davis. Holden's record doesn't matter, Marcus interrupted. What matters is that he broke the law. He violated my rights, humiliated me in front of the entire precinct, and put me through an ordeal for no reason other than his own biases. Russell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew the stakes were higher than they appeared on the surface. The arrest of an FBI agent wasn't just a mistake, it was a scandal waiting to explode. I'll handle Holden. You'll get your answers, Russell said after a long silence. But Marcus wasn't convinced. He could see it in the captain's eyes, a reluctance to take real action. The department was more interested in saving face than in confronting its own shortcomings. Marcus folded his arms, his expression hardening. You've handled it so far by doing nothing. It's time to act, Captain. The interrogation room. The Stark interrogation room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Officer Craig Holden sat at the table, his palms pressed flat against the surface. His posture was rigid, but his eyes were distant, as though he was already resigning himself to the inevitable. Across from him, Sergeant Patterson leaned forward, his eyes locked on Holden's. The officer had been isolated, left to stew in his own guilt and fear. Now it was time for the real questions. Craig, Patterson started, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. You arrested Agent Marcus Davis without probable cause. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Holden swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his thoughts scattered. I thought he was suspicious. Just a guy sitting alone in a park. No one does that without a reason, right? Patterson's eyes narrowed. You've been a cop long enough to know that assumptions don't get to dictate the law, Holden. And you sure as hell know that arresting someone without evidence isn't just a mistake. It's illegal. Holden didn't respond. His mind raced back to that moment in the park. The unease he had felt seeing Marcus alone, the way the man's presence had seemed out of place. But he hadn't checked his facts. He hadn't followed procedure. He had acted on his instincts, flawed instincts. I didn't mean to cause this much damage, Holden said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing. You thought you were doing the right thing, Patterson repeated, shaking his head. You've been a cop long enough to know that thinking is never enough. Holden was silent, his face flushed with embarrassment. The reality of his actions had finally begun to sink in. He wasn't just facing disciplinary action, he was facing the collapse of everything he had worked for. Marcus's reflection. Back at the FBI headquarters, Marcus sat in his office, staring at the case file before him. The room around him was filled with paperwork, reports, and pending investigations, but today, nothing seemed important. His thoughts kept drifting back to the events at the precinct. The arrest, the confrontation with Holden, and most of all, the larger issue of systemic racial bias in law enforcement. Marcus had been in law enforcement long enough to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just Holden's mistake, it was a symptom of a much deeper problem. The kind of problem that couldn't be fixed with a slap on the wrist. He ran a hand through his hair and picked up his phone, dialing his partner, Alex Williams. Alex, we need to talk, Marcus said, his voice tense. I'm going to need backup. This isn't just about Holden. It's about every officer who thinks it's okay to act on their biases. I'm not walking away from this until something changes. As the tension builds, Holden faces the consequences of his actions, while Marcus begins to rally allies in his fight for justice. Will the department take real action, or will it continue to sweep the problem under the rug? And what lengths will Marcus go to ensure that true reform comes to light? As the days passed, Marcus Davis couldn't shake the feeling that this incident had become more than just a misunderstanding between him and Officer Turner. The consequences of his arrest were beginning to ripple through the precinct, affecting not just him, but also the larger system he was a part of. The weight of what had happened lingered, and with it, a looming question: what would the department do to ensure something like this never happened again? It wasn't just the misguided assumptions and racial bias that left a mark on Marcus, it was the silent understanding that the law enforcement system, as a whole, had failed to protect him. It was the reality that his identity as an FBI agent didn't exempt him from the prejudices that ran deep in certain parts of the force. As Marcus sat in his apartment one evening, his phone buzzed. It was his contact within the department, a trusted source who had been helping him navigate the tense landscape of internal investigations. The text read, "It's not just Turner. There's a whole network of officers like him, and they're hiding something big." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. What was happening inside the precinct? How many others were like Officer Turner, fueled by their own biases and prejudices? And what were they protecting? The following day, Marcus received an unexpected call from his superior, Agent Thomas, at the FBI. "Marcus, we've been monitoring this situation. We know you're dealing with a lot right now, but we need you to stay focused. There's more at play here than just this arrest. We've got intel suggesting that there's a deep connection between some of the officers in that precinct and illegal activities." Marcus's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about racial profiling anymore, it was about something much darker. The investigation he was a part of, the one he had hoped would bring justice to his own situation, was now tangled in something bigger. Could Officer Turner have been involved in a larger conspiracy? Was his arrest a mere coincidence, or was it part of a much deeper cover-up? As Marcus prepared to meet with Agent Thomas the next morning, he felt conflicted. On one hand, he wanted to take down the officers responsible for his wrongful arrest. On the other hand, he knew that exposing corruption within the department could put him in even more danger than he was already in. The next day, Marcus arrived at the meeting with Agent Thomas. He was greeted with a sense of urgency in the air. "Marcus, we've been digging into this precinct," Agent Thomas began. "And we've discovered a pattern. There are officers who, like Turner, are connected to illegal activities. But it's worse than we thought, these officers are also involved in organized crime. We've got evidence, but we need your help to gather more." Marcus listened intently, his mind racing. He had known the precinct was flawed, but this was beyond what he had anticipated. Corruption. Organized crime. How many people had been harmed because of this network of rogue officers? "I'll do whatever it takes," Marcus said firmly. "I can't let this stand. Not after what they did to me." Agent Thomas nodded, appreciating his resolve. "We'll get you the backup you need, but you'll have to work carefully. The higher-ups in the department are involved, and if we're not careful, we could expose the whole operation." As Marcus left the meeting, he couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. This was no longer just about him or his wrongful arrest. It was about justice for everyone who had been wronged by this network of corrupt officers. He had made it through the first battle, but now, the real fight was just beginning. He knew the risks. He knew the stakes. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity. He wasn't just going to take down one officer, he was going to take down the whole operation, no matter what it cost him. And as Marcus stood on the brink of exposing the dark underbelly of law enforcement, he realized that his journey wasn't just about fighting for himself, it was about fighting for the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. The investigation had reached a boiling point. Marcus Davis sat in a small, dimly lit conference room at the FBI headquarters, surrounded by the few allies he had within the department. The walls, usually brimming with buzz and activity, now felt eerily quiet. As the team set up their plan, Marcus's mind raced through the past few weeks: Turner's arrest, the tension within the precinct, the hidden conspiracy, and the explosive discovery that the department was riddled with corruption. Each layer of the investigation had uncovered something more dangerous than the last, and the stakes had grown higher. Agent Thomas, his superior, placed a thick folder on the table, his face serious. "We've gathered everything we need. The corruption runs deep. Several officers, including Turner, have been directly involved in trafficking, illegal weapons sales, and protecting criminal organizations. Some of them are even on the payroll of cartel bosses. We need to take them down before they catch wind of this." Marcus felt a cold chill at the thought. This wasn't just about the rogue officers anymore, it was about a full-blown criminal network operating within the law enforcement system itself. The realization was overwhelming. Could he truly trust the FBI to protect him, knowing how far the corruption had spread? His connection to the precinct had made him a target. If they knew he was digging too deep, it could cost him everything. "We're going in tomorrow," Agent Thomas continued, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. "It's a coordinated strike, but you're going to have to play your part carefully. Turner might already be on the move." Marcus nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. He had come too far to back down now. The fight was bigger than any one officer, it was about protecting innocent lives and restoring integrity to a system he had once trusted. That night, as Marcus lay in his bed, he replayed everything that had led him here: his arrest by Turner, the systematic betrayal of his colleagues, and the dark network of corruption that had been allowed to fester unchecked. But now, it was time to strike back. The morning came quickly, and Marcus suited up, his body tense with anticipation. Every step felt like it could be his last. He met with Agent Thomas and the other members of the team, all of them resolute. The operation would unfold in phases, targeting the officers at the heart of the network. They would begin with Turner, and work their way up, dismantling the operation piece by piece. As the team prepared to move out, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous source within the precinct: "Turner knows you're coming. He's making moves. Be careful." Marcus's blood ran cold. The man he had once hoped could change, the officer whose racism and bias had almost destroyed him, was now part of something much darker. Turner wasn't just a bad cop, he was a key player in a criminal syndicate, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. The team quickly moved into position. Marcus, wearing his most serious expression, took his place among them. He was prepared for anything, but there was an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just about arresting officers anymore, it was about protecting his future and making sure justice prevailed, no matter the cost. As they moved in, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what Turner would do when confronted with the truth. Would he fight back? Would he go down swinging, or would he come clean? The questions lingered, but Marcus knew that there was no turning back now. The operation began with precision. Officers raided properties linked to the corrupt precinct members, seizing evidence, arresting key players, and disrupting the criminal network. But when they reached Turner's hideout, it was eerily quiet. The house was empty. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Marcus stood at the door, heart pounding in his chest. "Where's he?" he muttered under his breath. There was no sign of Turner, but there were signs of a hasty departure: furniture overturned, papers scattered, and a small suitcase left behind, half-packed. Turner had been tipped off. He was on the run. This was not the ending Marcus had hoped for. He had wanted justice, to see Turner held accountable for his actions. Instead, the officer had slipped through their fingers. "We need to find him," Marcus said, a cold edge to his voice. "And when we do, we end this." But the hunt for Turner was only the beginning. As Marcus stared out into the night, he realized that this fight was far from over. The corruption in the department was still festering, and the real battle had just begun. To root out the rest of the officers involved and bring down the entire network would take everything Marcus had. The sun set on the city, casting long shadows over the streets. Marcus Davis knew that with each passing day, the risks grew higher. But he was ready. He wasn't just fighting for his career, or for his freedom. He was fighting for the truth, and he would stop at nothing to expose the darkness within the system. This time, it was personal. And he would make sure that justice would finally prevail. If you believe stories like this can create awareness, hit the subscribe button and let us know, where are you watching from?